The racist and corrupt police officer tried to remove the black man from the courtroom without knowing he was a decorated United States Navy SEAL. What happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. It began on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the air inside a courthouse feels heavier than it should. The marble floors reflected cold fluorescent lights, and every step echoed like judgment. He walked in calmly, dressed clean, quiet, holding a file in his hands with legal documents, papers he had prepared for months to file an official complaint against a group of officers who had wrongfully targeted him. His expression was calm, but inside, he carried the weight of every unjust traffic stop, every suspicious glance, every quiet humiliation that came with simply existing as a black man in America. He was there for justice, not revenge. But what he didn't know was that justice had no room that day, not yet. As he approached the inner hallway, heading toward the courtroom window, a tall white officer stationed by the door glanced his way. That look. That slow, scanning stare that didn't seek identification, it searched for threat. And in a split second, the tension shattered the silence. The officer took a step forward and extended his hand to block the man's path. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" The words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like broken glass. Around them, people turned their heads, pretending not to notice what was happening, yet no one spoke. The man raised his eyebrows, confused but composed, and responded with quiet authority. "I'm here to file a complaint. I have documents, and I have an appointment with the clerk." The officer didn't look at the papers. His lips curled into a smirk, and his voice grew louder. "I said you're not going in there. You people don't walk into courtrooms like this unless you're in cuffs." Gasps echoed. A woman nearby dropped her pen. Someone stopped in the hallway and stared. But still, no one moved to intervene. He tried again, this time slightly firmer, lifting the file in front of him. "You're making a mistake. I have every right to be here." The officer's response came in the form of force. He shoved the man backward, papers flying from his hand onto the floor, scattering like broken dignity. As the man reached down to gather them, the officer pressed him against the wall, twisting his arm, whispering with venom only he could hear. "Try that military crap with me and see what happens. This is my court. You don't belong here." But what the officer didn't know was that the man he was trying to humiliate wasn't just any civilian. He wasn't a lost soul trying to pick a fight with the law. This man had served overseas, led operations in the dead of night, saved lives with nothing but instinct and courage. He had medals in boxes he never displayed, scars he never mentioned, and discipline forged in silence. He was trained to face enemies, foreign and domestic, but this was betrayal from within. He didn't resist. Not yet. He knew better. Instead, he looked the officer in the eyes and said something that would haunt the entire room later. "You're going to regret this moment." But no one took him seriously. The guards doubled down, escorting him out, accusing him of disturbing the peace, while dozens of people walked past without even making eye contact. Outside the courtroom, as he gathered his scattered documents in the wind, a quiet rage settled behind his eyes, not anger, not even sadness, but the ache of someone who had endured this pattern far too many times. They didn't ask his name. They didn't look at his ID. They didn't care why he was there. He had already been judged, by his skin, by his presence, by a system that taught that black men were threats before they were citizens. Inside, the officer laughed with his colleagues. Another one thinking he can outsmart the system. Pathetic. But he wasn't done. And he wasn't walking away. What no one in that courthouse knew was that this man wasn't only there to file a complaint. He was part of an undercover collaboration with the FBI, working to expose a string of racial abuses from within law enforcement, and every move that officer made was already being monitored. He was wearing a mic. The hallway had cameras. And the report he carried? It wasn't just a complaint, it was a piece of a much larger operation that had been quietly unfolding for months. They tried to break him without knowing he was there to break the system itself. He was the storm walking silently through their fortress. And the courtroom that silenced him would soon become the stage of his loudest reckoning. But what happened when the truth came out, was far beyond anything anyone in that courthouse expected. The same officer who pushed him, cursed at him, and threw him out with disgust would soon be standing handcuffed in the exact same spot, eyes wide, as the courtroom watched justice twist back in on itself in a way no one saw coming. But how? How did that man turn the courtroom into the biggest reckoning of that department's history? And what exactly did he do that left the judge, the prosecutors, and even the spectators in complete disbelief? You're going to want to stay until the very end, because this isn't just a story about disrespect. It's about what happens when the man you tried to silence becomes the voice that ends your entire career. Before we start this story, here's a message for every black viewer watching. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a space of respect, empowerment, and justice. Your voice matters. Your life matters. Your story deserves to be heard. Now sit back, and get ready for an unforgettable story of strength, dignity, and a powerful comeback. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Let's begin. His name was Malik Thompson, and even before he opened his mouth, people judged him. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of what he looked like, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence that unsettled those who had never learned to separate confidence from threat. In civilian clothes, he blended into crowds, moved with precision, and never called attention to himself, but his energy spoke louder than any words ever could. Born and raised in the south side of Chicago, Malik grew up surrounded by both beauty and struggle. His mother, Denise, was a schoolteacher who gave more than she ever received, and his father, Harold, was a former Marine who taught him early on that discipline was a form of freedom. Their neighborhood wasn't easy, but it was home, and it was where Malik learned to walk with dignity no matter how the world tried to shrink him. He had always been different, not louder, not more aggressive, just more aware. While other kids played in the streets, Malik watched. He observed the way the world shifted when he entered a store. He noticed how teachers reacted when he answered too quickly in class. He learned the code switching early. He understood when to smile, when to speak, when to be silent. And he mastered the art of being underestimated. That became his greatest tool. After high school, when many of his friends struggled to find direction, Malik enlisted. Not because he was lost, but because he needed to escape the box he was born into. He joined the Navy, and soon after, was selected for BUD/S, the brutal training program for the SEALs. Out of hundreds, only a handful made it. Malik was one of them. Years later, after countless missions, a chest full of ribbons he never bragged about, and a reputation as one of the most reliable operators in his unit, he returned to civilian life, not because he had to, but because he wanted to serve in a different way. His skills hadn't dulled, his instincts were still razor-sharp. But he was tired. Tired of fighting wars abroad only to come home and feel like he was still viewed as a suspect in his own country. He had seen too much, lost too many, and carried the kind of weight that made it hard to sleep at night. So when he moved to Durham, North Carolina, a place quieter than Chicago, but no less tense in its undercurrents, he did so looking for peace. A modest apartment, a gym where he could train quietly, a local barbershop where he found brotherhood. That was enough. But peace doesn't always knock at your door. Sometimes, it hides behind a badge and a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Officer Raymond Crowley was everything Malik had spent his life navigating around. White, mid-40s, stiff-backed, always eager to assert control. He wasn't just a cop, he was the kind of cop who thought the badge gave him a pass to treat people differently depending on the color of their skin. He had been on the force for nearly 2 decades, collecting complaints like dust. But the system always covered for him. He knew the rules, and he knew exactly how far he could go without facing consequences. His power didn't come from the law, it came from the silence around it. And in a place like Durham, where many still whispered about race instead of confronting it, that silence was deafening. Crowley didn't know Malik. Not yet. But the moment would come. It all started when Malik witnessed a traffic stop outside a diner. A young black teenager being pulled out of his car, handcuffed, for refusing to cooperate, though all he had done was ask why he was being stopped. Malik didn't interfere. He just stood across the street and recorded. Not because he was looking for trouble, but because he knew that in moments like that, truth needed witnesses. The video he uploaded didn't go viral, but it reached the right people. The boy's family filed a complaint. And within days, Malik was contacted by a civil rights attorney. She asked if he'd be willing to testify. He agreed. Quietly. Without drama. But Crowley had friends. And one of them tipped him off that a black guy with a chip on his shoulder was planning to file a statement. Crowley didn't panic. He just waited. Malik, meanwhile, prepared his documentation. He knew how to do things the right way. He had filed paperwork. He had confirmed a time with the courthouse clerk. And on that day, he showed up early, dressed in a clean black button-up and pressed slacks, documents in hand, walking with the quiet authority of a man who knew where he was going. But Crowley was already stationed at the courthouse entrance. The look in his eyes wasn't about protocol, it was personal. He didn't see Malik. He saw a problem to erase. A threat to control. And the moment Malik reached for the door, Crowley stepped in. What followed was humiliating. Not just because of the physical aggression, but because of the silence. People saw. They heard. They paused. But they did nothing. To them, it was just another black man being handled. And that's how Malik ended up on the sidewalk, papers scattered, pride shaken, anger simmering beneath the surface like lava beneath stone. He didn't explode. He didn't fight. He just watched. What Crowley didn't know, what no one knew, was that Malik wasn't just filing a complaint about a single incident. He had been working with a federal team gathering evidence of abuse inside local law enforcement. He had names. Reports. Testimonies. And he had recorded everything that happened at the courthouse, from the first shove to the last insult. But this wasn't the moment for revenge. Malik understood timing. He understood that sometimes, power comes from patience. Back home, Malik sat at his kitchen table, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Not because he was confused, but because he wanted to remember exactly how it felt. The burn of humiliation. The coldness in Crowley's eyes. The stillness of everyone else. That was the fuel. That was the reminder of why he did what he did. And as he stared at the folder of evidence, his jaw tightened. This wasn't over. Across town, Crowley poured himself a beer in his backyard, laughing with two of his buddies from the force, reenacting the moment he put that loudmouth in his place. He didn't know he was being watched. He didn't know that the very man he had tried to erase would soon be the one to rewrite the story completely. But change doesn't shout. It moves in silence. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one everyone tried to ignore. And in a few days' time, they would all learn who Malik Thompson really was. But what they would never expect, was the way he would reveal it. The days that followed were quieter, but the silence carried weight. Malik moved with intention, keeping to his usual routines, never revealing the storm building behind his eyes. He woke early, worked out at the same gym, passed the same neighbors on his morning runs. To anyone watching, he looked the same, but inside, something had shifted. The courthouse incident had lit a fuse, and now he was watching, calculating, waiting. Every second since that humiliation outside the courtroom was a moment spent sharpening the blade of truth he was about to wield. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to do it right, with the precision of a man trained to dismantle systems from the inside out. And yet, the hardest part was staying quiet while the world kept spinning like nothing had happened. The civil rights attorney he'd been working with, Naomi Ellis, was one of the few people who truly understood the depth of what was unfolding. In her mid-30s, razor-sharp, with a reputation for shaking city offices to their core, Naomi had been working behind the scenes with Malik for months. When he came into her office days after the courthouse incident, she could tell something was different. He didn't speak much at first. He dropped the flash drive onto her desk and looked out the window for a long time. She finally asked, "What did they do?" Malik took a moment before answering, his voice steady, but low, like thunder hiding behind clouds. "They tried to break me in front of everyone. They didn't ask my name. They didn't look at a single paper. Just saw me, and decided I didn't belong there." Naomi sat forward, grabbing the drive. "You got it on camera?" "Every second." That was all she needed. She plugged it into her laptop and watched in silence. Her lips pressed together, fingers twitching with quiet fury as the video showed everything, the shove, the words, the laughter in the officer's voice. The worst part, though, was the crowd. The stillness. No one did anything. No one even flinched. Naomi didn't say much after it ended. She simply leaned back, closed her eyes, and said, "This changes everything." They spent the next few days in strategy. Malik, Naomi, and a small legal team she trusted. No leaks. No press. Everything moved under the radar. Malik knew better than to let ego guide the mission. This wasn't about going viral. This was about structural damage, blowing a hole through a system that protected men like Crowley. What they needed was a courtroom. A stage. A trap laid so carefully, so precisely, that when it closed, there'd be no escape. And they had it. The young man from the diner traffic stop, Darius Holmes, had agreed to press charges. His family, at first skeptical, now stood firm with Naomi leading the case. But there was more. Malik had built a folder of testimonies from others who had faced similar abuse from Crowley and his circle. Quiet stories. Whispers. But when placed together, they formed a pattern, an undeniable chain of racial targeting, threats, falsified reports. It was no longer about one incident. It was a web. And Malik stood right in the center. But power doesn't let go easily. One evening, as Malik left the gym, he noticed a patrol car across the street. It wasn't just parked. It was watching. The same car followed him 3 blocks, didn't pull him over, didn't flash its lights. Just shadowed. Malik didn't flinch. He knew the game. Surveillance was a message. A reminder that they were watching too. When he told Naomi, she looked worried, but Malik reassured her. "Let them watch. I've got nothing to hide." But she pushed back. "This isn't about hiding, Malik. It's about making sure you get to court alive." That night, she arranged for him to stay at a private condo she owned under a different name, just in case. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. And Malik, trained for war, respected that kind of preparation. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving faster than expected. The energy had shifted. Tension was beginning to pulse through every interaction. A week later, the courtroom date was set. Malik would be there, not as a victim, but as a witness for the prosecution. The city didn't know that. Crowley didn't know that. As far as the public was concerned, it was just another low-profile case about police misconduct, the kind that rarely makes waves. But inside that courtroom, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The morning of the hearing, Malik stood in front of the mirror, tying his navy blue tie, hands steady, expression unreadable. He wore a charcoal gray suit, not flashy, but sharp. Everything about him communicated discipline, purpose, restraint. Naomi stood in the living room, reviewing documents, pacing with that nervous rhythm that only lawyers understand. When she looked up and saw him, she paused. "You ready?" Malik didn't smile. He didn't need to. "I've been ready for years." They entered the courthouse quietly. No media. No noise. Just two people walking into a battle no one else saw coming. Inside the courtroom, the judge, an older white man named Gerald Whitmore, was reviewing documents. Known for his strict demeanor and zero tolerance for theatrics, Whitmore had a reputation that cut both ways. Fair when he wanted to be. Cold when he didn't. His eyes lifted when Malik entered, lingering for a moment before returning to his papers. Across the room, seated comfortably in his pressed uniform, was Officer Crowley. He didn't recognize Malik at first. His gaze skimmed over him, uninterested. It wasn't until Naomi leaned in and whispered something to the bailiff that Crowley's expression shifted. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But Malik caught it. Recognition. And beneath it, fear. Crowley leaned toward the defense attorney, whispering urgently. The attorney glanced over his shoulder, then at Malik, then back at Crowley. Whatever was being said didn't matter. The energy had already shifted. Crowley's comfort was cracking. Naomi stood to present their first witness. Not Malik. Not yet. She brought forward Darius Holmes, the young man from the diner traffic stop. His testimony was clear, painful, and full of trembling pauses. The court listened in silence as he described being thrown against his car, threatened, mocked. When asked to identify the officer, he pointed directly at Crowley. Crowley shook his head slightly, playing the part of the misunderstood veteran. But the room had already shifted. Malik felt it. The cracks were beginning to show. Naomi called her second witness, an older woman named Teresa Lyles, who testified about a separate incident 2 years prior where Crowley accused her son of theft without any evidence. Her voice broke twice. And though the defense tried to object, the judge allowed it all in. Then Naomi paused. Your Honor, the prosecution would now like to call a witness whose presence was not previously disclosed due to security concerns. The judge narrowed his eyes. And who might that be? She turned, nodded, and Malik stood. The room fell silent. Crowley's face went pale. And the moment Malik took the stand, something electric passed through the room. Not just because of who he was, but because of the way he stood. Calm. Controlled. Like a man who had waited for this moment his entire life. He raised his right hand, swore in, and took a seat. Naomi turned toward him, her voice steady. Mr. Thompson, would you please tell the court what you witnessed on the morning of April 3rd, outside the Durham County Courthouse? Malik leaned forward, eyes locked on the judge, not on Crowley. His voice was quiet, but every syllable carried weight. I witnessed a man with a badge abuse his authority, assault a civilian, and attempt to silence a voice he didn't even take the time to recognize. The judge raised an eyebrow. And how do you know it was Officer Crowley? Because I was the civilian. Crowley's chair shifted. The court stirred. A low murmur rippled through the room. Naomi stepped closer. And do you have proof of this? Malik reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a drive, and placed it on the table. Everything is on here. Video, audio, timestamps. From multiple angles. And what the court would see next, would change everything. But not yet. Because what was on that drive wasn't just a video. It was a key. To something much, much bigger. And tomorrow, when court resumed, everyone in that room would find out what Malik Thompson had really come for. And not a single one of them was ready for it. The courtroom was different the next morning. It wasn't the lighting, or the temperature, or the murmurs that echoed between the walls, it was the air itself. Something had shifted. There was a heaviness now, not of fear, but of anticipation. Every eye followed Malik as he entered, not with arrogance, but with the composure of a man who had nothing left to prove. Crowley was already seated at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot from a night without rest. He hadn't spoken much to his lawyer that morning, and the silence between them now was loud enough to fill the room. Malik didn't even look in his direction. He walked with Naomi down the aisle, took his seat, adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, and placed the same small flash drive from yesterday gently onto the table before him. Judge Whitmore entered minutes later, his usual stern face even more unreadable than usual. He greeted the room, adjusted his glasses, and leaned forward with hands folded beneath his chin. "Ms. Ellis," he said calmly, "you may proceed." Naomi stood slowly. Her voice had none of the urgency or theatrics that often filled courtrooms. She was composed, almost too calm. That alone made people listen more closely. "Your Honor, yesterday, our witness provided testimony that he was physically and verbally assaulted by the defendant, Officer Raymond Crowley, on the morning of April 3rd. Today, with the court's permission, we'd like to present visual and audio evidence to support that statement, and more." The judge gestured for her to continue, and Naomi walked over to the monitor, connecting the drive without a word. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, nothing but silence. Then, the footage began. Clear. Crisp. Captured from a discreet body cam on Malik's lapel. Every word spoken by Crowley outside that courthouse played loud and sharp in the silent room. The shove. The insult. The contempt. But that wasn't what made the room change. What changed the room was the moment Malik's voice calmly said, "You're going to regret this moment." Crowley shifted in his seat, face tight with panic now masked by fake indifference. His attorney whispered something, but he didn't respond. The judge didn't interrupt. He just stared, eyes frozen on the screen. And then, another video began, one that hadn't been mentioned before. It was dated from 3 weeks prior. Crowley pulling over a black father and his 2 kids, accusing them of driving a stolen vehicle, forcing the children out of the car, guns drawn. No probable cause. No explanation. Just violence dressed in procedure. Gasps echoed. Then came the audio logs. Voicemails Crowley had left on the department's internal system, joking about quotas, calling neighborhoods by slurs, mocking the very people he was paid to protect. Malik didn't speak during any of it. He simply sat, face calm, hands folded, letting the truth rise like smoke in a burning room. Naomi paused the video and addressed the court. "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson's role here today was not only as a victim. He's been working in collaboration with the Office of Civil Rights and federal investigators for over 6 months to expose a pattern of racial abuse embedded within the Durham Police Department. He's a retired Navy SEAL, a decorated combat veteran, and he's been serving his country long before any of us walked into this courtroom. And he was treated as a criminal because of his skin." A stunned silence fell. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked directly at Malik for the first time. "Is this true, Mr. Thompson?" Malik stood. "Yes, sir. I volunteered to assist in an investigation after witnessing multiple unlawful stops involving black residents. I recorded and documented every incident I could. I collected testimonies, contacted victims, and brought it all to the Department of Justice. This, what you're seeing today, is only a fraction." The courtroom exploded, not with noise, but with energy. Spectators exchanged stunned glances. A reporter at the back scribbled furiously. Crowley's attorney stood, objecting to the late presentation of evidence, but the judge didn't raise a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Crowley. You're going to want to hear all of this." And then, Naomi handed over the final document, an official memo from the FBI confirming Malik's role in their joint investigation and the upcoming internal review of the entire department. The judge read it silently, lips tightening with every line. When he looked up, there was something new in his eyes, respect, maybe, but also shame. The kind that comes from knowing the system had failed under his watch. Crowley could barely hold himself together. He finally broke the silence, his voice cracking as he turned to Malik. "You set me up. You planned this." Malik didn't blink. "I didn't set you up. You did this to yourself. I just gave the truth a platform. Crowley laughed, but it was hollow, desperate. You think you're a hero? You think any of this changes anything? Malik's voice was low, but it cut through the courtroom like a blade. It already has. The judge turned to the bailiff. Detain Officer Crowley pending review of the evidence and possible charges of civil rights violations, assault, and abuse of power. Crowley stood in disbelief as the bailiff approached. He raised his hands slowly, as if still expecting someone to stop it all, as if waiting for the system to step in and protect him like it always had. But no one did. The cuffs clicked. And in that moment, something happened that the courtroom would remember for years, not the sound of the cuffs, not the gasps, but the silence on Malik's face. Not triumph. Not revenge. Just clarity. Just a man watching justice finally begin to move. Outside, the news vans were already arriving. But Malik didn't stop for the cameras. He stepped out into the light, alone, the courthouse doors closing behind him. But what happened next, what he said on those steps, was something no one expected. Something that would ripple far beyond the walls of that courtroom. And that is what changed everything. The crowd outside the courthouse had grown. Reporters elbowed for space while cameras clicked in a steady rhythm, flashing like artificial lightning as the heavy wooden doors creaked open behind them. But when Malik stepped out, there was no bravado in his posture. No fist raised. No speech rehearsed. He simply stood at the top of the stairs, still wearing the same suit, his face a portrait of controlled emotion. Naomi followed closely behind, her expression caught somewhere between pride and exhaustion. For a moment, the world paused. Questions flew through the air, names shouted by journalists desperate to be acknowledged. Mr. Thompson, is it true you were part of an FBI operation? Mr. Thompson, do you have any comment on Officer Crowley's arrest? Are you planning to take legal action? But Malik didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the sunlight warm his face, breathing in the kind of air that only feels different when you've waited a lifetime to be seen for who you are. Then he spoke. I didn't come here to destroy a man. I came here to expose a system. What happened in that courtroom wasn't justice served, it was justice beginning. And if anyone thinks this ends today, you've missed the entire point. The cameras clicked faster, but the noise around him began to fade. Malik wasn't talking to the press anymore. He was speaking to something greater. Something deeper. I've worn a uniform. I've served this country. And still, when I walked into that courthouse, I was treated like a threat. Not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. That's the truth. And that truth deserves more than headlines, it deserves change. Naomi touched his arm gently, a signal it was time to step away. They descended the stairs together, the crowd parting like a tide around them. Some people clapped. Others watched in silence. And others still looked on with confusion, unsure how to respond to a black man who had just dismantled a system without ever raising his voice. Malik didn't stay for interviews. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted impact. Real, lasting impact. Later that evening, as they sat across from each other at Naomi's office, a small television mounted on the wall played a loop of the day's footage. Crowley in cuffs. Malik on the courthouse steps. Headlines spinning faster than the public could process. Malik leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. He really didn't see it coming. Not even when I sat in front of him. Naomi exhaled slowly, sipping her tea. Because men like him never think the rules apply to them. They don't see men like you until it's too late. And even then, they don't understand how it happened. Malik looked down at his hands, calloused and strong. These were the same hands that had patched up wounded teammates overseas, that had held brothers as they took their final breaths, that had written reports detailing the very abuses he had experienced firsthand. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were holding pain. They felt steady. Naomi broke the silence again. There's going to be fallout. You know that, right? He nodded. Of course. They'll come after my credibility. Try to flip the narrative. Paint me as an angry vet with a grudge. Naomi's eyes narrowed. That's why we don't stop here. This isn't just about Crowley. We keep going. Internal Affairs already reached out. They want your full cooperation in the upcoming review. This could go federal, Malik. You could change the entire landscape of how misconduct cases are handled. He didn't respond right away. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the quiet street below. For all the noise of the day, the city still moved forward. Cars rolled by. People walked with their heads down. The world didn't pause just because truth had been revealed. That's what made it so hard. Justice wasn't loud. It was slow. Relentless. Often invisible. Do I even want to be the face of this? Malik finally asked. I didn't do this for the spotlight. I did it because I couldn't stay silent anymore. Naomi stood and joined him at the window. You don't have to be a symbol. Just be a man who stood up. That's more than enough. And whether you want it or not, people saw you today. They saw something they haven't seen in a long time, courage without noise. Strength without ego. That matters. There was a pause before she added, soft but pointed. And if you walk away now, who fills that silence? Malik didn't answer. Not because he didn't know. But because he knew all too well. The next morning brought more than headlines. It brought calls. Messages. Anonymous threats. Praise. Gratitude. A flood of noise from every direction. Some wanted to thank him. Others wanted to warn him. But Malik had already made peace with the weight of visibility. The moment he stepped into that courtroom, he had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. He met with Internal Affairs that afternoon. Laid everything out. Every report. Every recording. Every piece of evidence meticulously organized. The two agents listening across the table looked stunned as the full scope of what Malik had collected unfolded in front of them. One of them finally asked, "How did you get all this?" Malik looked him in the eye. Because I've been invisible for most of my life. And when people think you don't matter, they show you who they really are. The investigation expanded quickly. What began with Crowley led to 2 other officers, then 5, then 7. A pattern of abuse that had been buried beneath years of bureaucracy and fear. And through it all, Malik stayed steady. Quiet. Focused. He didn't attend rallies. He didn't speak on podcasts. He kept building. Kept assisting. Kept handing over the truth. But change comes with resistance. Late one night, Malik returned to his apartment to find his front door slightly ajar. His instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't enter. Called Naomi. Called the authorities. When the police arrived, they found nothing stolen, but his files were disturbed. His laptop missing. A clear message. The system may have cracked, but it hadn't broken yet. Naomi was furious. They're trying to rattle you. Malik stayed calm. They want me scared. But they don't know what real fear looks like. I've seen it. I've lived it. This is desperation. He moved out the next day. Kept his location private. Naomi arranged for secure communication lines. Federal agents increased protection around him and his data. But still, Malik never faltered. And then came the final subpoena. Crowley's lawyer filed an emergency motion to have all charges dropped, citing entrapment, character assassination, and mental distress. The judge granted a hearing. One last attempt to reverse the course of justice. Naomi briefed Malik carefully, but he already knew what had to be done. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was even more packed than before. News vans, activists, legal observers. Malik entered quietly. No suit this time. Just a plain white shirt and dark slacks. No symbols. Just presence. Crowley was already seated. Paler than ever. Sweating. His lawyer was aggressive, throwing accusations like darts, claiming Malik had manipulated the system, that he had sought personal revenge. The judge listened in silence. Then Naomi stood. Her voice was calm but laced with fire. Mr. Thompson didn't seek vengeance. He didn't break the law. He exposed it. He used truth, not tactics. And if this court chooses to ignore what's been brought forward because the reality is uncomfortable, then we are all complicit. Then she turned to Malik. Would you like to make a final statement? Malik stood, and this time, his voice was louder. I didn't come here to destroy a man. I came to show that the uniform you wear doesn't protect you from accountability. I fought overseas for values that were denied to me here. And if I had to choose again, I would do it all the same. Because silence is not survival. The room was silent. And that silence said everything. The courtroom emptied slowly after Malik's final statement. No gavel slam. No dramatic outburst. Just a thick, echoing silence that settled into every corner like dust. The weight of what had been said, what had been revealed, hung over everyone like fog. Some whispered, others avoided eye contact, unsure of how to process the unraveling of something they had either ignored or pretended didn't exist. But Malik didn't stay to soak in the aftermath. He walked out the side door with Naomi, his footsteps heavy but not unsteady, like a man who knew he'd won a battle but was still standing in the middle of a war. The courthouse behind him remained still, but the world beyond its walls had already started shifting. Outside, there was no applause this time. No cheering. The reporters were there, sure, but even they seemed quieter now, their voices subdued, their questions more careful. Malik passed them without a word, his eyes scanning the street, his mind running through 100 things at once. Not fears, Malik didn't operate on fear, but variables. Retaliation, media manipulation, political pressure. This wasn't over, not really. In some ways, it was just beginning. Naomi caught up to him, her voice lower than usual, touched by something deeper. You did something bigger than any courtroom decision today. Malik didn't look at her, but his response carried weight. Then why does it feel like it's only going to get worse from here? That question lingered between them as they got into the car, the city moving around them like a machine that hadn't yet noticed its gears had shifted. And maybe that was the problem. Justice, when it comes, doesn't stop the machine. It just forces it to grind, screech, and resist until it breaks. In the days that followed, the consequences began to surface like bruises after a fight. Crowley was officially suspended without pay pending further investigation. 2 other officers named in Malik's reports were quietly put on leave. The department issued a statement, one of those polished, sterile paragraphs filled with, "We take this seriously," and, "We are reviewing our procedures," but empty of anything that resembled real accountability. Malik didn't bother reading it in full. He knew the language of self-preservation when he saw it. But what he didn't expect was the split reaction from the public. On one side, messages of support flooded his inbox, veterans, young activists, everyday people thanking him for not backing down, for showing that silence isn't the only option. But on the other side, came the shadows. Voicemails with veiled threats, anonymous comments accusing him of betrayal, people suggesting he was just another angry black man with a vendetta. It didn't surprise him. What cut deeper was the subtle shift in how he was treated in public. The grocery store clerk who used to greet him with a smile now avoided his gaze. The gym buddy who used to chat between sets now kept his headphones in. Not because they hated him, but because he made them look at something they didn't want to see. Naomi noticed it too. During one of their meetings, she sat across from him, flipping through updates from internal affairs, then looked up with that tight, analytical stare of hers. You're becoming a symbol. Whether you wanted to or not. And people don't like symbols. They can't argue with what you said, so they'll try to dismantle who you are. Malik let out a slow breath, leaned back in his chair. Let them try. I'm not a symbol. I'm just a man who stopped swallowing what they kept feeding me. But even as he said it, he knew the deeper truth. Being just a man wasn't a luxury he could afford anymore. The eyes were on him now, and they were looking for a crack, a misstep, anything they could use to validate their denial. That pressure built quietly, not in headlines, but in expectations. What would he do next? Would he sue the city? Would he speak at rallies? Would he run for office? Everyone had a vision for what Malik should become, but no one asked what he wanted. That question haunted him late at night, when the phone stopped ringing and the city noise faded into a hum. What do I want? He had exposed the corruption. He had stood his ground. But now came the harder part, living with the consequences of truth. Not just the threats, but the responsibility. The questions from young people who looked up to him. The anger from those who felt betrayed. The confusion from those who still didn't understand why any of this had to happen. One evening, Malik sat alone in his apartment, watching an interview play out on the news. A former city council member was discussing the case, dancing around direct criticism, but clearly uncomfortable. They called Malik well-spoken, a term that always carried a bitter aftertaste, and passionate, as if his clarity were somehow a surprise. Then the anchor asked the question, do you think Mr. Thompson's actions have harmed public trust in law enforcement? Malik stared at the screen, heart steady but jaw tight. Harmed public trust. The question wasn't just insulting, it was revealing. It showed the depth of denial still rooted in the system. As if it were the exposure of injustice, not the injustice itself, that caused harm. He turned off the TV, stood by the window, and looked out over the street below. Kids were playing basketball under dim streetlights. Music drifted from a nearby porch. Life went on. And that was the dilemma. Malik had changed the course of something fundamental, but for the world around him, daily life hadn't paused. How do you fight for systemic change in a world trained to look away? The next morning, Naomi called him in with news. The Department of Justice wanted to speak with him directly. Not just about the investigation, but about a possible position. A chance to consult on broader reform strategies. His name had reached places he hadn't expected. It was the kind of opportunity people dream of. Influence. Reach. A seat at the table. But Malik hesitated. At the meeting, a senior DOJ official greeted him with warmth, praised his bravery, offered a package that included resources, a platform, and security. But when Malik asked about their long-term plans for implementation, the answers got foggy. Words like pilot programs, measurable impact, and community engagement were thrown around like currency, but nothing concrete. Malik left with a smile on his face but a pit in his stomach. The game was shifting, not ending. Power doesn't disappear, it just changes its outfit. That night, he met Naomi for dinner. The restaurant was quiet, tucked into a corner of downtown where the noise didn't reach. Over wine and soft jazz, she asked what he thought. It's all strategy, he said. They want to neutralize the storm by inviting it inside. I get it. It's smart. But if I go in, I can't just be a seat filler. I need to be real change. Naomi nodded. Then make that clear. Set your terms. Don't let them define what you're walking into. You didn't start this to end up being used. Malik looked at her, eyes serious but soft. Do you ever feel like no matter what we do, it'll never be enough? She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. Every day. But we do it anyway. Because even if it's not enough, it's something. And that something becomes more when we refuse to quit. Malik let the words sit. The clink of glasses. The hush of conversation around them. For once, the world didn't feel like it was demanding something from him. It just was. The following week, He gave his answer to the DOJ. "I'll work with you. But not on your terms. On mine. And the first step is cleaning out every room before you build a new house." The official didn't push back. He just nodded, perhaps relieved, perhaps worried. Malik had become too public now. Too respected. They couldn't afford to lose him. But Malik wasn't thinking about leverage. He was thinking about legacy. About what it meant to push back, not just in the courtroom, but in the daily grind of policy and paperwork. Real change wasn't glamorous. It was tedious. It was slow. It was thankless. But it was necessary. And deep down, he knew the real challenge hadn't been Crowley. It was everything that let Crowley exist unchecked for so long. That was the machine. And Malik was done letting it run. But what he didn't know yet, was that the final card hadn't been played. Because there was one person still watching, still waiting, still holding a secret that would change everything once again. 3 weeks had passed since the hearing that shook Durham's courthouse to its core, but the city had not yet settled. The air still buzzed with the quiet hum of tension, conversations held in whispers, stares held a little too long, some out of respect, some from discomfort, and others from something Malik knew all too well, fear disguised as contempt. Yet beneath all that, there was also something new, something fragile but alive, hope. Conversations were happening. People who had once sat silent in rooms full of injustice were beginning to speak. Names were being questioned. Files reopened. Malik's name no longer belonged to just him, it had become a thread that others now followed. And though he carried that weight with grace, it weighed heavier with each passing day. Naomi had started drafting a proposal for long-term reform within the Durham Police Department. It included mandatory body cams, civilian review boards with actual decision-making power, anonymous internal reporting systems, and mental health screenings for officers. Malik read through every word with the sharp focus of a man who understood that real change wasn't just about headlines, it was about structures, policies, systems that outlived speeches. Late one evening, as the office emptied out and papers lay scattered across Naomi's desk, Malik leaned over and tapped a section of the draft that listed minimum training hours. "This won't be enough," he said quietly, pointing to the number. "It can't just be hours. It has to be about what they're taught in those hours. We need cultural bias training led by people outside the force. We need survivors to speak. We need them to hear what this does." Naomi looked up at him, her face tired but still burning with that relentless fire he had come to respect. "You're right. Let's change it. We'll push for external voices. Real accountability." As they worked, a sense of quiet rhythm settled between them. Not comfort, there was little comfort in confronting a system designed to protect itself, but rhythm. Trust. Two people building a ladder where there was once a wall. But even in that rhythm, Malik felt a shift. A shadow. Something he couldn't name yet but that tugged at the edge of his focus. And that shadow would soon take form. The next morning, Malik received an anonymous envelope at the front desk of Naomi's office. No name. No return address. Just his name typed in capital letters. Inside was a single flash drive and a folded note with one sentence: "He wasn't working alone." Malik stared at the sentence for a long time, his fingers tightening around the paper. He didn't say anything to Naomi right away. He just slipped the flash drive into his coat pocket, thanked the receptionist, and walked outside. He needed space. He needed silence. He needed to listen to his instincts. Back at his apartment, he plugged in the drive and opened the only file inside, a grainy, time-stamped security camera video showing a back entrance to the police precinct. It was late at night. A figure approached, Crowley. But he wasn't alone. Another man walked beside him, taller, broader, face hidden under a cap. They exchanged something. An envelope. Then a handshake. The video cut out. Malik's mind raced, but his breathing remained slow. Controlled. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. He went over the footage again, frame by frame, noting every detail, the way the second man moved, the symbols on his jacket, the angle of his shoulders. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. And it meant Crowley was part of something larger. A network. Maybe a protection ring. Maybe something worse. That night, he met Naomi at a quiet cafe far from downtown. He showed her the footage, watched her face shift from curiosity to tension to something close to rage. She looked at him, voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea who that second man is? Malik nodded slowly. I'm not sure. But I think I've seen him before. He was present during my second testimony. Sitting in the back row. No reaction. No note-taking. But his eyes never left me. Naomi straightened, suddenly alert. We need to bring this to internal affairs. Not yet, Malik said firmly. If we bring it too early, it disappears. This has to be airtight. I want to know who he is. I want to know why he's hiding. And I want to know what Crowley gave him. Naomi didn't argue. She understood the stakes. She understood Malik. Over the next few days, they began their own quiet investigation. Naomi used her legal contacts to pull access logs from the precinct. Malik reached out to one of his trusted sources within a veteran support network who still had ties to private security groups. They worked in silence, meticulously piecing together fragments until a name surfaced: Derek Maddox. Former officer. Retired under a misconduct cloud that was never fully disclosed. Now working as a private consultant for internal audits across several precincts, including Durham. When Malik heard the name, his stomach sank. Maddox was known in certain circles for cleaning things up before they reached court. He was the man you brought in when you needed problems to vanish. If he had met with Crowley, it wasn't to deliver warnings. It was to bury the truth. Malik insisted on a meeting. Face to face. Against Naomi's protests, he made contact through an old intermediary and arranged to meet Maddox at a public park during daylight. He wore a wire. Naomi waited in a car nearby, phone in hand, her body tense like a coiled spring. She hated not being in control of the room. Malik told her softly before getting out of the car, "Don't worry. I've stood across from worse men than him." When Maddox arrived, he was calm, composed, almost friendly. He wore a blazer, sunglasses, and the easy grin of a man who always stayed one step ahead. He extended his hand, which Malik didn't take. Maddox raised an eyebrow and chuckled. "So it's like that, huh?" Malik kept his voice flat. "Let's not waste time. Why were you meeting with Crowley?" Maddox shrugged. "Old friend. He needed advice." "Advice about what?" "How to make evidence disappear." Maddox's smile didn't falter, but his tone darkened. "Careful, Thompson. You're making enemies faster than you're making progress." Malik leaned in slightly. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Malik paused, then delivered the blow. "That conversation you had. It's on video. You've already been identified. This is your chance to talk before your name ends up in court documents and national headlines." The mask slipped for a second. Maddox's jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight. "You think you've won something? All you've done is poke the surface. You don't know how deep this goes. You're just one man. And when the spotlight moves on, you'll be alone." Malik didn't flinch. "I've been alone before. But I'm not anymore." That was the moment. The shift. Maddox's eyes registered it. The knowledge that the fear tactic hadn't worked. That the man in front of him wouldn't fold. And then, without another word, Maddox turned and walked away. Naomi was waiting when Malik got back into the car. Her voice was tight. "You got everything?" He nodded. Every word. She stared ahead for a moment, then said, "This isn't just about a corrupt officer anymore. This is about infrastructure. Protection rings. Legacy lies. If we expose this, we're not just changing a department. We're starting a war." Malik leaned back in his seat, the weight of truth pressing down on him once again. "Then it's time we stopped calling it justice," and start calling it what it really is, a reckoning, and they both knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. The following days moved like a storm with no thunder, just a low, building pressure that you could feel deep in your bones. Malik woke up each morning not with dread, but with a growing clarity that something irreversible had been set in motion. He wasn't reacting anymore, he was leading. The meeting with Derek Maddox had shifted the terrain beneath their feet, revealing not just cracks in the system but entire caverns, hidden networks, quietly protected officers, data trails that led into murky corridors of backroom deals and rewritten reports. And Malik, for the first time, realized the magnitude of what he'd walked into. He wasn't just dismantling a broken process. He was unraveling a fortress built to withstand scrutiny. And now, that fortress was watching him closely. Naomi sat across from him at her office table, their laptops open, documents scattered, both of them surrounded by the mess of resistance. Her voice was steady but tinged with urgency. This isn't just a local cleanup anymore. We're sitting on evidence of collusion, real institutional protection. If we leak too early, it gets buried. If we wait too long, they come for you. We need a secure way to release this when the time is right. And more than that, we need allies. Inside the system, Malik leaned forward, eyes locked on the timeline they were building on the screen. Names. Dates. Correspondences. A roadmap of corruption. I have someone in mind. Former JAG officer. Clean record. Now works at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He owes me a favor. Naomi didn't even blink. Then let's use it. But we do this carefully. Every move from here is either a step forward or a step into a trap. Malik nodded, but his mind was already ahead, already rehearsing the call, already weighing the risks. There was no turning back. And strangely, he didn't want to. Not anymore. That night, he sat in his apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the window, and called Devin Pierce, the man he had saved during an overseas op in Kandahar years ago. Devin had been a raw recruit back then, wide-eyed and reckless, but brilliant. Malik had dragged him out of a burning transport vehicle under enemy fire. That kind of bond didn't break with time. When Devin answered the phone, his voice cracked with recognition and something like disbelief. Malik. Man, is that really you? Malik's voice was calm, direct. I need a favor. And I wouldn't be calling unless it was serious. Devin didn't hesitate. Say the word. Malik laid it all out, no dramatics, no omission. Just the raw truth. The footage, the systemic corruption, the protection rings, the Maddox meeting, everything. And when he finished, there was a long pause. Then Devin replied, voice low, serious. All right. I know someone. He's not flashy, but he's straight. He's been pushing for a deeper audit on police accountability but couldn't get traction. I'll connect you. Just be careful. If what you're saying is true, you're not walking on cracks anymore. You're walking on tripwires. The connection was made the next day. Malik and Naomi met with Assistant U.S. Attorney Carlos Bennett in a secure federal building, just 2 blocks from the courthouse where this all began. Carlos was quiet, observant, with eyes that missed nothing. He didn't speak much during the presentation. He watched. Listened. Took notes. And when Malik showed the footage of Maddox and Crowley, something in Carlos' posture shifted, like he'd just been given the final piece of a puzzle he'd been chasing for years. This is bigger than Durham. This ties into Atlanta. Memphis. Even Newark. We've been tracking something similar. But we lacked the thread to pull it all together. Naomi leaned in. Now you have it. Carlos sat back, folded his hands. I can't promise the DOJ moves fast. But I can make sure this doesn't disappear. And I'll recommend witness protection. Your name is going to be on a lot of lists. Malik shook his head. I don't want protection. I want results. Carlos gave him a long look before nodding. Then you'd better get ready. Because once this breaks, it's going to hit harder than anything you've faced before. And he was right. By the end of the week, multiple subpoenas were issued. Internal Affairs was flooded with anonymous statements. One of the officers previously tied to Crowley suddenly requested legal counsel and began negotiating a deal. Pieces were falling. But Malik knew that the closer you get to the truth, the louder the lies become. That Friday night, his apartment was broken into again. Nothing was stolen. Just papers shuffled. Drawers left open. A bottle of cologne tipped over on the sink. It was a message, and it wasn't subtle. He called Naomi, who arrived within the hour. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, surveying the mess. Her voice didn't waver. "They want to scare you into quitting." Malik stared at the door, then back at her. "Then let's make them regret opening that door." They filed a report, but they knew it wouldn't be investigated properly. So Malik moved out that night. Naomi gave him her spare key and insisted he lay low, at least until the DOJ responded officially. Malik complied, but not out of fear, out of strategy. Staying in the light didn't mean exposing yourself to darkness. It meant choosing your battles, protecting your momentum. Inside Naomi's apartment, the air felt different. Calmer. Focused. They worked in the living room, laptops open, coffee growing cold. And for the first time in weeks, Malik allowed himself to ask a quieter question: what happens when this is over? Naomi looked up over. He clarified: when the headlines fade. When the next tragedy comes along. When people stop talking about justice again. What happens to all of this? She sighed, deeply. We keep going. We use the momentum. We turn public pressure into policy. And we build something that doesn't fall when the cameras leave. Malik nodded slowly, then leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. You ever get tired? All the time. Then why do you keep going? Because stopping means they win. And I refuse to lose to fear. He looked at her, something heavier in his voice now. And what if this costs me everything? Naomi met his eyes with unwavering intensity. Then you'll know it was for something bigger than you. And sometimes, that's the only thing that makes it worth it. They didn't speak after that for a while. They didn't need to. Some truths don't require echoes. The next day, Carlos called. The DOJ was initiating formal proceedings. A federal investigation into multiple jurisdictions, with Durham as ground zero. Malik's recordings would be central evidence. It was happening. And with it, came exposure. Media requests. Panel invitations. Book offers. Malik declined them all. He wasn't done yet. But then came something unexpected. A letter. Handwritten. Delivered by courier. No return address. Inside, a short message. You only scratched the surface. If you really want to break this open, go back to the Academy records. Start in 2003. Ask who trained Crowley. Malik stared at the letter, every instinct screaming that it was a trap, and yet, something inside him knew better. This was a door. One that no one had walked through yet. One that might lead not to the end, but to the very beginning. And if he opened it, there might be no coming back. The file Malik received, the letter that pushed him back to the Academy records from 2003, opened a door no one expected. With Naomi's help and Carlos's federal access, he uncovered a buried report tied to Crowley's early days as a cadet. It detailed a violent altercation during training, a racially charged incident involving another black trainee who had mysteriously dropped out just days later. No investigation was ever launched. The file was signed off by one name, Derek Maddox. That was the beginning. Maddox had been the training supervisor then, and it became clear that what Malik was fighting wasn't just a group of corrupt officers, it was a pipeline. A system that, for decades, had trained prejudice into procedure, had protected those who crossed lines, and had silenced those who tried to speak. With the help of Carlos and a DOJ task force, they launched a deeper audit into Maddox's training history and connections. What they found was staggering: over 20 officers currently active in departments across multiple states, all with disciplinary flags buried under Maddox's tenure. It wasn't a local problem. It was a blueprint of systemic rot. Malik testified again, this time in a federal hearing, his voice broadcast to rooms far beyond Durham. His words didn't waver. His story was now a case study. And Naomi, with her tenacity and brilliance, became lead counsel on a national commission for law enforcement accountability. Together, they authored a proposal that would forever alter the way police academies operated across the country, implementing federal-level oversight into training programs, independent background checks on instructors, and mandatory ethics renewal evaluations. Maddox was indicted on multiple counts of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to tamper with investigations. When the cuffs were placed on him, it happened outside a private security firm he'd once owned, in front of the same kind of cameras that had ignored victims like Malik for years. He didn't say a word during his arrest, but the weight of exposure hung from his shoulders like lead. Crowley, stripped of his badge, pled guilty in a deal to reduce his sentence, but he lost everything. His pension. His reputation. His place in a system that once protected him. He now sits in a correctional facility far from Durham, reduced to a number in a jumpsuit. But the most telling punishment wasn't prison, it was watching the world change without him, watching the very structure he helped uphold be torn down by the man he once tried to humiliate. Naomi became a national voice for legal reform. Her face appeared in publications and televised panels, but she never lost her edge, never softened her stance. She stayed in Durham, continued representing victims of state abuse, and built a coalition of attorneys who had once felt alone in their fight. She remained grounded because Malik kept her that way. And together, they remained vigilant, two people who had walked through fire and refused to let the world forget how hot it burns. And Malik? He did not return to silence. After the investigations concluded and policy reform began, he was offered countless opportunities to cash in, book deals, exclusive interviews, politics. But he chose something else. He opened a center in Durham, the Thompson Initiative, a program for young men and women who had lost faith in justice. Veterans. Victims. Activists. It became a place of healing, strategy, training. Not just a safe space, but a strong one. He taught martial arts to kids who were once afraid to walk home from school. He mentored teenagers who had lost siblings to police violence. He showed them discipline, not as control, but as self-worth. He taught them that their silence was never the answer, and that strength, when rooted in truth, can move mountains. One afternoon, as Malik watched a group of teens spar in the training hall, Naomi walked in holding a folder. She handed it to him, smirking slightly. A letter of recognition from the Department of Justice. They're naming you as one of the top 5 contributors to national police reform in the last decade. Malik took it, looked at the gold seal, then quietly folded it and tucked it away in a drawer. That's nice, he said. But this right here, this is the real award, and it was. The initiative was thriving. Families had begun to heal. Conversations were happening in town halls, not behind closed doors. Local officers now underwent mandatory community immersion before being allowed to patrol. Change, slow and bruising, was no longer a dream. It was tangible. And Malik had become more than a symbol. He was a pillar. But change always asks a question: what comes next? And so we ask you, the listener, the witness to this journey, what would you have done? If you were humiliated in public, treated as less than human, would you have remained silent? Would you have fought back with fire or with focus? Because Malik didn't choose the path of vengeance. He chose the harder one, the path of endurance, of discipline, of clarity. He chose to be a mirror to a nation that often turns away from its own reflection. And the truth is, Malik could be any one of us. His story is not just a story of justice. It is a story of courage. Of restraint. Of revolution through character, not chaos. It asks all of us to look at the systems we trust and ask, are they really built for everyone? And if not, what will we do about it? So now, we leave you with this: what would you do if the system meant to protect you turned against you? Would you still believe in change? Or would you become the silence that allows it to keep happening? Tell us in the comments how this story made you feel. What part hit you the hardest? What truth did you see reflected in Malik's journey? And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you stop and think, then don't keep that feeling to yourself. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and join us as we uncover more stories that challenge the system, celebrate the underdog, and remind us that the human spirit, when pushed to its edge, is capable of the most incredible comebacks. We'll be here, bringing light to the shadows, one twist at a time.